Politics protesters and banning British butter knives. Yes, we can. Next on The Dr. Duke Show. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Duke, and thank you for joining us today. As always, I am joined by Katie Petrick of The Healthy Republic, and we're going to do the countdown. Katie, what do you have for us this week on the agenda?
Well, we've all been glued to our Facebook accounts watching Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg testify before Congress the past couple days, and he's gone now before the Senate and the House to answer questions about the recent security breaches that have happened with Facebook and more than 87 million users' data being released and obtained by Cambridge Analytica, which is a political data firm. And so the question has been on a lot of people's minds as to Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook's responsibility. They are a publicly traded company. What does it mean that their data is, or our personal data is getting used by Facebook and getting out to others?
You know, the first thing that dawns on me about all of this is what an absolutely sort of drab individual he is. There's a reason, unlike Steve Jobs or even Bill Gates, who is very monotone and uninteresting in many respects. At least you get a sense with Gates that there's something, there's more than just a hamster spinning the wheel behind those glasses. With Zuckerberg, it's almost kind of like a drab zombie. The other thing that we should probably start by pointing out is the whole thing was a dog and pony show. He was not under oath. Many of the people who were interviewing him, the committee, many of them had had invested in his own Facebook company, so he was beholden. They were beholden to him. A lot of Democrats out there shilling, and they would not have even had this conversation if it weren't for Cambridge Analytica, right, which they think may have been concluding with Russians. The simple fact that we know for a fact that Zuckerberg's company is colluding against Republicans, conservatives, and Christians, seemingly didn't interest anybody. But they try to get their little pound of flesh about Cambridge Analytica. I found with the exception of Ted Cruz actually taking him to task, which I thought was kind of interesting. These guys are not prepared. They never do get grilled they never have to really deal with people who have different worldviews. And so to see Ted Cruz push him and just the vacant stare of the eyes and the ability to really say anything meaningful back to Ted Cruz tells you that something we have to keep in mind. These high-powered movers and shakers in the Progressive Party, they're not terribly gifted necessarily. They're just doggedly committed and well-funded in the pursuit of ideology. So when you see them in a situation like that, someone like Zuckerberg in a situation like that, I think the inevitable response is, really? This is somebody who, good for him, he had a great idea, good for him. He's used the capitalist system that he seeks to tear down to enrich himself fabulously. Good for most of those Democrats on the committee who kind of both kissed his behind, deferred to him, and then tried to go after Trump and ignore what Facebook was doing. And then a big shout out to Ted Cruz for actually at least making him squirm a little bit in that seat.
And one of the things that Ted Cruz made him actually come out and say was Zuckerberg said, Silicon Valley is an extremely left-leaning place. He left himself completely out of that analysis, but he did admit that Silicon Valley is an extremely left-leaning place. And he also said that he believes Facebook and the purpose of Facebook is that it is a platform for all ideas. And one of the issues that many of the senators, many of the members of the House we're grilling him on is, how do you view Facebook? Is Facebook responsible for all the content that it has? And so if Facebook is a platform, they don't have liability. But if it's a publisher and then it's responsible for that content, then there's a lot of liability and there could be a lot of lawsuits. At the same time, in various points of his testimony, he said both, yes, it's a platform, and yes, it's a publisher. So
yeah, I think he did inelegantly open the door to challenges to that whole business. He simultaneously denied that they had any power while then turning around and suggesting that really power belongs to us. He reminds me of a junior faculty member in a major university, right, who keeps insisting that we're tolerant, we're open, and I see them all the time on campus. We're open-minded, we're tolerant, we believe in the free exchange of ideas. That's the public face of it. And then when they get in the classroom, they're shutting down any kind of discourse they dislike. Their own attitudes are shockingly intolerant in the way they behave to others. Zuckerberg can pretend all he wants that Silicon Valley is where all the left-wingers are, but when you're out there proposing a universal income, right, and doing some of the goofy initiatives that he is, it's hard to understand any divide between them whatsoever.
Yeah, and he did well enough, at least after day one. They had estimated the Facebook stock rose 4.5%, and he personally made $2.6 billion.
Well, I think that's because it dawned on everybody that Congress and the Senate, and this goes back to Loretta Lynch. This goes back to the woman who ran the IRS. I forget her name, Lois Lerner, right? But the one thing we know with all of these congressional subpoenas, these hearing committees, people don't go, they don't show up, nothing happens to them. People refuse to answer questions. Nothing happens to them. People show up in a forum like this. I think the American people have realized that nothing's ever going to happen to anybody unless they can get their hands on Trump. So I think the market took a deep breath and realized that, okay, nothing's going to come of any of this. We can go back to funding Facebook because Congress won't get involved.
Yeah. At the same time that Zuckerberg was testifying, Paul Ryan actually was announcing his retirement, and he's not going to seek another term in the House of Representatives, which means he's going to be leaving his post as Speaker of the House at the end of this term. We know that, in 2015, he actually replaced John Boehner as Speaker, and since that time, the House has done some things, but not nearly what
like
Paul
what?
Ryan would say.
What are the some things they've done?
Well, the tax
the tax reform, which Republicans had to be dragged kicking and screaming to support. Well, we're in Wisconsin, and I can tell you simply this: that Paul Ryan has been John Boehner in a better suit with a less orange tan. That's all it is. I'm tremendously
crying too.
Less crying, right? I'm terribly disappointed. I mean, here's a guy who ramrodded through the Every Student Succeeds Act, right? 2015, destructive, setting into law the worst aspects of Obama's Common Core scheme, gave his caucus basically a day and a half to read an 1,100-page bill, and nobody at Christmas time, so nobody knew about it. You think about this omnibus bill that he signed off on, this ridiculous overspending. You think about fully funding Planned Parenthood, right? Fully funding Planned Parenthood. Pretty much everything Paul Ryan said he stood for in one of the most powerful positions of government, he didn't really support and didn't really protect. Did nothing on the borders, did nothing meaningful on immigration. And so, all you can say is that, well, good luck on your lobbying career. I mean, because that's what's going to happen. He'll come back here, and then 6 months later, you're going to find him lobbying. And I'll bet you my bottom dollar he is not lobbying for conservative causes, right? Maybe some rhino causes, maybe some borderline bipartisan issues, maybe even some slightly Democrat issues. You won't see Paul Ryan lobbying for really conservative issues. You just won't see it. You didn't see it when he had the gavel. What makes you think you're going to see it now?
All right, so Dr. Duke has spoken. That's what's going to happen. What's interesting to me is, from the political side, obviously we know that any midterm election is all about a referendum on how the president is doing. And so when we take a look now that, Paul Ryan announced that he's not running for re-election, we know there's going to be other Republicans who have announced that they're not running.
There are many, actually.
Yeah, and we have 23 seats that the Democrats need to get to take over the House. So it'll be interesting as we move forward. The DCCC had been looking at Paul Ryan actually to target that as a place to put a lot of money, and now maybe they'll shift their funds to other areas.
Well, already some polling groups have actually put Paul Ryan's seat into the hands of Democrats. Mm-hmm. I think a Democrat will replace him, which is very possible. Wisconsin here, we just elected a radical liberal to the Supreme Court, which threw off the Republican balance. It looks like there's a blue wave happening in many parts of the country, including Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the unlikely so-called Republican states that happen to vote for Trump but don't look like they're going to vote for a lot of conservatives or Republicans moving forward. And I guess it just comes down to this. We've seen it for 2 years. I mean, you're right to some degree, particularly after the first 2 years of a presidential term, the first-term president, you see a lot of turnover. That's unremarkable. I think if the Democrats were to pick up 25, 30 seats, which they very well might, some of that, though, you have to attribute to the fact that what has this Democrat Congress done? What has this Republican Congress and Senate done to make you want to vote for them? This is the thing, This Congress and the Senate, if they had spent more time, these Republicans, making the left angry and really pissing off Schumer and those guys and Pelosi, I think a lot of Republicans would have stood by them. But they have more anger and more unwillingness to compromise with their own party, at least a huge percentage of their party. They're never particularly fond of Donald Trump at all, and they oppose him at every angle. And so, it's as sad as it is for me to point this out. I think the blue wave is going to come, and it's going to be less about Democrat empowerment or the country lurching radically to the left. It's going to be a lot more about why keep electing guys who play at conservatism but never deliver it.
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to whoever is stupid last, because that's what's going to stick in the minds of the American voter. So
I'm going to bet this. I'll make one more prediction. I think this is going to be actually not a particularly well turned out election.
Well, yeah, and we always know that the midterm after, presidential election, it will be lower anyway.
Lower.
I think it's going to be even lower. I agree with you.
I agree. Yeah, I think it's going to be lower than obviously a presidential election. But I think with all these predictions about lots and lots of people turning out, I think they're going to be surprising numbers of Democrats, not just Republicans who don't go to the polls this fall.
Everyone's staying home. Speaking of a home, we did find out that President Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen's office and home were raided this week by the FBI. And so everyone is questioning what the Mueller investigation is the one that led this charge, and they got the warrant to do so. What does this have to do with anything? They were in there to try and find information on the alleged affair that President Trump had with the adult film star Stormy Daniels. And the fact that Mueller's investigation is leading the way, why is this even happening?
Yeah, it's an odd thing, I mean, everybody knew that Trump was sexually loose. Everybody knew that. His supporters, his enemies, elected him anyway. What this has to do with anything, it doesn't really seem to have anything to do with it. And the fact that he's looking for not Russian stuff, more or less, tells you that he doesn't really have anything. I think if we had any serious stuff coming forth on Russia, it'd be out there by now. So they're just looking. This is a classic Al Capone situation, right? Where if you can't get a guy, convene a grand jury, do all this stuff, provide a special counsel, give them almost unlimited wealth, resources, and power, even to go into to potentially violate the client privilege of lawyers to go after Cohen. You can do that all you want, I suppose, but what you're looking for now is some other way to hang him, right?
Tax evasion.
Tax evasion or something, or I don't know, some kind of perjury. If you can get him that way, you'll get him that way. It's just a shame, though, in the sense that this is not what he was put there to do. And the fact that nobody, it's the same thing with we just talked about the congressional hearings. Nobody seems to have any teeth. There's no teeth to any, well, when Republicans are in power. There seems to be no teeth for people who do bad. And when Democrats in power, they radically circle the wagons, as we're going to see probably this fall, radically circle the wagons around people who on their side do bad things. So it just bespeaks from top to bottom a dysfunctional system.
And it's really quite interesting because Alan Dershowitz, who is a strong advocate of civil liberties, actually came out and said that civil libertarians should be concerned whenever the government interferes with lawyer-client relationship. I believe we would have been hearing more from civil libertarians, the American Civil Liberties Union, attorney groups, and privacy advocates if the raid had been done on Hillary Clinton's lawyer.
Absolutely.
And that's quite an interesting turn because we haven't heard anything about, where is civil liberty rights groups? Where are they coming forth? There's not a peep.
Well, you think, first of all, about the kind of fishing expedition, well-paid, taxpayer-funded fishing expedition that we've turned Mueller loose on. Actually, you think about that, and then you think about how serious many of the allegations against Hillary Clinton were, how devastating they were in Benghazi, how the server business, the felonious way she handled top secret information, the careless way she did that. And she had a server in her house. It's almost like she set up an adjunct of the White House in her own living room, for God's sake. And this idea that people weren't going to be tracking her left and right. The question is, why isn't there at least a parallel Mueller going after her? This is the failure of the Republicans. This is why they're going to lose a lot, right? At the very least, they could have there would have been ample reason and justification to put Hillary Clinton's team under the exact same scrutiny that you're putting the president, but alas, nothing, right? And to wind down on this, let me just say this. The left is going nuts on Dershowitz now, right? He's a traitor. He's a sellout. Dershowitz is Jewish. He's a lawyer. He's a progressive. He's also a college professor. These are the privilege of the left, right? So this is a doctrinaire man of the left who's simply pointing out, and I respect him for saying this, what they're doing to you Republicans, they can do to us Democrats one day, right? Now, again, that implies a Republican Party that has decided to grow a pair sometime in the near future. I don't see it happen. They haven't done it yet.
Okay, well, we're going to turn to a kind of a follow-up to a story we reported on last week, and I actually covered for the Healthy Republic this week. George Washington University held a workshop, I guess they would call it, on Christian privilege, now saying that we already know that whites are privileged, we know that males are privileged, well, let's add Christianity into that mix. And I spoke with one of the attendees of this workshop, and she said that basically they were taught about three privileges that Christians have. One being that they're safe, their safety in being a Christian, that the assumption that the majority of people are Christian, and that Christians have access to their spiritual spaces. And what's interesting is we just got a story completely proving that wrong, and it's from China. China has just banned online sales of Bibles. Yeah. What China's trying to do is they're trying to crack down on all these loopholes that Christians were being able to fight against. And now they already couldn't be selling Bibles to any retailers other than certain stores that they deemed were accessible. But now you can't do it online. Yeah,
there's a real problem with this in terms of seeing. Of course, they would argue this is American Christianity, right? We don't what happens in China, and why would these Christians want to? If Christians should know better. China's a wonderful communist country. Christianity doesn't need to spread itself there. They take the multicultural perspective on that. But go back to the three things you said that this George Washington conference argued: that Christians have access to their own religious places.
Yes.
I mean, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Who doesn't have, right? I mean, where in the Western world do people not have access to their own religion? Are Muslims being locked out of their own mosques in America? Of course they're not, right? We're actually giving Muslims in many public and private and colleges the ability to pray on campus. We would never give that to Christians or Jews, right? Dedicating bathrooms for their ablutions, setting aside rooms where Muslim students can gather to pray. We're banning Christian Bible readings from dorms. So this idea somehow that only Christians have access to their religious spaces is absolute hogwash, number one.
Well, in my point on the spiritual spaces that you see popping up more and more, we're calling them safe spaces. They're on college campuses. For a lot of these students, these progressives, their spiritual spaces are these safe spaces. And so to say that they don't have access is just completely
that's right. And the idea that the majority of Americans are still Christians is privilege, right? Well, the majority of university professors are liberals. The overwhelming majority. How come, again, we never talk about their privilege, right? Why do almost exclusively white people educated beyond their intelligence with tenure, why do they get to decide for the rest of the country what a safe space is or who has privilege? And why don't they ever investigate their own? They're one of the few clienteles in American life that after 6 years, they become tenured for life. They can't be fired. Well, unless, of course, they say stupidly conservative things, and then you can still get rid of them. So what was the first one? So we looked at two of them.
The safety. The assumption that right. You can be safe. Right. And obviously, the point is, across the world, we know the persecution that is happening. We know that's happening right within the borders.
Of Christians, absolutely.
Yeah, of Christians.
Well, but I ask you this, Muslims aren't safe in this country? I mean, I remember back at 9/11, they were telling us how all this horrible things were going to happen. They never did. Americans, and the majority Christian culture of Americans, left Islam alone, left Muslims alone. I can't think of a single episode of a Buddhist being harassed. Can you? I mean, no. What have we majority Christians in this country actually done to make anybody feel unsafe? In fact, we've welcomed them, right? Try opening a church or a synagogue in Saudi Arabia. See how far you get with Buddhist temples in Afghanistan. But you know what? You got them all here. We've even got the Church of Satan in this country, allowed to set its anti-Christian displays alongside Christian displays at the holiday time. So all of that is just progressive wonkery. It's stupid, it's juvenile, it's finger-pointing. With all of this privilege stuff, all it is list off everything that a progressive doesn't like and then claim it has privilege, right? Yep.
All right, we're going to end on a positive story, though.
Positive story, all right.
Because there is Christian privilege here. The Crimson Tide football team just visited the White House. That's the University of Alabama Crimson Tide. They visited the White House because they won the 2017 NCAA National Championship. And what was very cool about it is that at the end of it, a bunch of the football players got around President Trump and they prayed. Mm-hmm. And so we hear all about how all these players say, oh, well, when I win a championship, I'm not going to go because they're so anti-Trump. And it's kind of just cool and nice and positive for once to see something.
As far as we know, and that's even with 2 years of Trump now, as far as we know, there's only one president in recent memory who was doing a lot of hand-laying in the White House and cigar laying, and that was President Bill Clinton, right? This is and throw that back up there again, Mike. This is a wonderful image of the appropriate kinds of hand laying in the Oval Office in the White House. And what I love about this is Christian privilege. This is the burden of Christian privilege. What they call privilege, we call the burden, right? It is to be unabashedly faithful, even in public spaces. And I love the fact that one of the kids on the Alabama football team basically said to President Trump, will you allow us to pray with you? And look what you've got there, a very diverse group of kids, racially, ethnically, who are surrounding the president. They have laid hands on him. They are praying with him. If that's Christian privilege, my college faculty friends, if that's Christian privilege, we should have it in every faculty lounge. We should have it in every chancellor's office. We should have it in every classroom. If that's the kind of stuff that Christian privilege gets you, praying with a president that even many of those kids didn't support, then Christianity's onto something.
Amen.
Amen.
In this corner, your pugilistic pundit, the Duke of Diplomacy, the Professor of Patriotism, the Doctor of Domestic Tranquility.
This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke.
Well, you wouldn't know it from watching the news. I mean, CNN didn't cover it 24/7. There weren't all sorts of 16-year-olds marching in the streets, cussing at you and threatening you because of your gun rights. And there was no genital-shaped knit caps present whatsoever. But there was another national protest, the National ProLife Walkout. Students at 200 different high schools, over 80 colleges, 250 student groups nationwide walked out of their educational institutions today for 17 minutes of silence and prayer. Let that sink in for a second. No yelling, no cursing, no screaming, no violence, just silence and contemplative prayer. And that 17 number is significant. The marches that were spurred by the Parkland shooting, they marched out of their schools for 17 minutes because 17 people lost their lives, which is a horrible amount of people. But bear in mind, as the organizers of this protest told you, the protest for life, that in 17 minutes, Planned Parenthood every day has the capacity to kill 10 children. 10 lives lost. The protest was organized by Rockland High School's Brandon Gillespie. And he is a young motivated student who thought that there was hypocrisy here. If what we care about is the death of children, well, then how can we neglect the much, much, much greater carnage that abortion does to babies as opposed to guns? In fact, Gillespie, who was in a history class at his high school in California, his own high school teacher was suspended in the days leading up to the march because she simply posed the question in class, is it fair? Would we, public schools, allow the same level of tolerance if kids wanted to march in the name of anti-abortion rights, right? To shut down places like Planned Parenthood. And we now know for a fact that the schools are not nearly as tolerant. Julianne Benzel was put on administrative leave simply for suggesting the possibility. And when young Mr. Gillespie went to the teachers and the school to ask for the same kind of consideration that the Parkland kids got, right? Suspend tests and put off homework assignments, they were, of course, denied it. Matter of fact, the administration of the school in Rockland High School, said that we do not support the march against abortion because it is not, get this, viewpoint neutral. It is not viewpoint neutral. This is what progressives do now. Every left-wing initiative, because all these kids marching in the streets for gun control, that's what they were marching for. They weren't marching to simply honor the victims. All sorts of initiatives, all sorts of action points were thrown out there about how to punish the NRA and Dana Lash and on and on. That apparently was viewpoint neutral. So all progressive initiatives are viewpoint neutral, which means by definition all conservative ones are biased. That's just how the left rolls these days. Although I would like to point out that since about 1970, there are 70 million babies not capable of walking out of anything.
If you like what you've seen on today's show, make sure you're sharing it with all of your friends. And make sure to catch the Dr. Duke Show free online every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube and Facebook Live. Then listen to it again on the podcast version on SoundCloud and iTunes. And don't forget to subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, and then again, tell all your friends. And now, it's time for Dr. Duke's Quote of the Day.
News out of London has London overtaking New York in terms of murders, becoming one of the great murder capitals of the world. And London, as you know, has one of the strictest anti-gun regimes of any city in the whole world. And now many of these kids, including kids as young as 17, teenagers, toddlers, being knifed to death in London because they can't get their hands on guns, evidently. And London's Mayor Sadiq Khan, his response to all of this is to, you've got it, begin to do street searches for anybody who may be seeming to have. Is that a knife in your pocket? Are you happy to see me? If you have something protruding in a knife-like form on your body, you will get stopped by the police and searched if necessary. This is the same Mayor Khan, by the way, who in 2015 actually tried to stop search policies on streets when they related to guns. And so here he is now changing his tune. And this put me in mind of a great quote by C.S. Lewis. Lewis once wrote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies." Is there a better definition, by the way, of the left? Omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own consciences. And this quote from the ever-prescient C.S. Lewis explains exactly why progressive tyrants, people who come at us from a progressive point of view and take away our rights, our liberties, our freedoms, our responsibilities, they're not doing it to enrich themselves. They're not doing it because they want to stop this or that particular behavior. They do it because it appeases their own sense of their own righteousness. They're doing it because it pleases their conscience. This is the problem with liberalism. It cannot be sated with this much of your freedom. It's got to have this much. And once it has this much, it needs that much more. We have to fight these people, not with guns and knives. There are none of those left in London, apparently. We've got to fight this with common sense logic and a return to liberty. And that does it for us this week. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke, and we'll see you next time.